Well, my name is Leo. I'm sales director for Canada and the USA, and I'm delighted to be your host for today's session. Very nice to have you with us. We're thrilled that you've taken the time to join us for Ask the Expert, the Spring Fertilizer questions. So before we get started, there are a few things to go over. I'd like to take a moment to introduce my teammates who will be helping with the call today. Nicole Smith Windsor and Devin Simpson, our marketing team running all activities behind the scenes. They do a great job to make this happen. Also, Peter Gross is a co-founder of Lucent Biosciences. So Peter, he manages Lucent Bio's patents and he really loves to engage with the agriculture community. We are incredibly fortunate to have with us today a leading expert in the field of fertilizer and soil health on the prairies. Once again, Mr. Rigas Karamanos. Dr. Karamanos, a soil fertility expert, has held academic and industry roles with Esso Chemical, Westaco, Viterra, and Koch Fertilizer. Now retired, he is a fellow of the Canadian Society of Agronomy, a distinguished agronomist, and also a Saskatchewan Agriculture Hall of Fame inductee. So his insights into the role of micronutrients like zinc in a balanced fertility program will be invaluable as we plan for a successful spring this year and beyond. Dr. Rigas, I know people know you very well, but I appreciate if you can introduce yourself to the ones that still don't know you. Thank you.
Hello. Well, you've already introduced me. Now I'm retired. As Leo mentioned, I came to Canada 52 years ago and landed in Saskatoon. I did my master's and PhD there. Then I taught at the University of Saskatchewan. And also, ran the Saskatchewan Soil Testing Lab, which was the provincial lab at that time. And then, of course, the governments decided to walk out of all this, and that's when we privatized the lab. It's not in existence anymore. Anyway, I'm happy to be here. I'm going to attempt to give answers to the questions that were given to me. But at the same time, if you are one of the persons who has submitted questions, I may need your help to elaborate what you're really talking about. So I can give you the right answer, okay? Thank you, Leo. That's,
Sounds good. Thank you, Dr. Rigas. I want to thank you, everyone, again. You guys taking the time to be here with us. Very important. We know how important is this season for you guys. I just want to take a moment to explain a little bit. So feel free to submit your questions in the chat box or Q&A that you see below your screen at any point during the conversation. Okay, we will start with the pre-submitted questions first, followed by live questions and submitted via the Q&A function in this platform. I will let my colleague Peter conducting the session. Thank you so much, Peter, for helping us today.
Okay, thanks everybody. Might as well just get started. Here's our first question from David Borth in Vanderhoof, BC. And you can see it on your screen. How does soil nutrient availability differ between gray-wooded, gray-luvisoilic soils and more typical prairie brown, dark brown, and black? And the tag to that question is, how should typical fertilizer recommendations be adjusted to reflect this? I think this is a really good question because this applies to a lot of people.
Yeah, well, if you, I know for the prairies, and actually it's really interesting because there was a professor when, back in the 70s and 80s at the University of Saskatchewan, Dr. Pam Mi Wang, who had done a very extensive, he was soil mineralogy, and what he showed very clearly that as we move from southwest Saskatchewan to northeast or southeast Alberta to northwest, what happens is that we go from the brown to dark brown to black, and then of course to the alluviosolic gray soils, gray wooded. What happens is the primary minerals, in this particular case, the study was on potassium, which is one of the questions there. What he found out is as we move those directions, the primary minerals, such as feldspars and micas, that are the source of potassium in our soils, drop dramatically. Consequently, as we move those directions, the potassium deficiencies will increase and there'll be much more, response to potassium. And now phosphorus is a little bit different, but still, because the source of phosphorus is different than the potassium. And of course, micronutrients, again, there is an impact of the mineralogical composition. And that's the bottom line in answering this question. As we move from the brown to dark brown to black to gray wooded, the mineralogical composition of the parent materials from which the soils have been developed changes. And as a result, when that happens, the nutrients that are being released also change. So I hope this answers your question.
Thank you. I think that's a great one. Let's keep things moving along here. This question is from Chad Wallach from Manitoba. Are we seeing more tie-up of micros due to different nutrient ratios, such as the phosphorus to zinc ratio, nitrogen to sulfur ratio? Do those ratios affect tie-up, and how?
Well, there is actually a lot of research that has been done on the phosphorus-zinc interaction, but has nothing to do with tying up. What happens is that the more phosphorus you add to the soil, and that is only for certain crops, such as flax, peas, beans, wheat to a certain extent, but absolutely no impact on canola. What happens is when you have crops that their rooting system has mycorrhiza on it, when you have too much phosphorus, it kills the mycorrhiza. And actually, I was part of a study, and it's already published in the scientific literature at the University of Saskatchewan, where they were adding different levels of phosphorus. And I had a graduate student that showed that the infection of mycorrhiza went from 40% down to 10%. Mycorrhiza take up zinc 4 times more efficiently than the plant roots. So when you have too much phosphorus, you kill the mycorrhiza in the roots and you reduce the zinc uptake. So yes, is there a certain ratio? Well, maybe not, but too much phosphorus. And when I'm saying too much phosphorus, I mean 80 pounds, and you got to remember when you seed place phosphorus, you may be seed placing 15, 20, or 30 pounds. But if you were to apply to the whole field what you're applying in the seed row, it's going to be hundreds of pounds. So conceivably, you can have some interaction, okay? From that perspective, is that it drops the infection of mycorrhiza, and that's why zinc drops. Nitrogen, sulfur, there is actually, I had also work show, with nitrogen to sulfur ratio, especially for canola, we didn't find any impact. And with wheat, what we found is, sulfur will influence a bit, maybe indirectly, the protein content, but there was no any impact of the nitrogen to sulfur ratio on the yield of crops.
Okay, great answer. Thank you. Let's move along here with the next one. And this one is from Christy Dupuis from Lake Country Co-op. And agronomically, what is the best form of fertilizer? Is it dry liquids? What are slow release elementals? What do you think, Rigas?
Well, again, now what we need to do is we need to clarify what nutrients we're talking about. Now, looking at the screen, when it says ammonia, most likely we're talking about nitrogen. When it comes to micronutrients, which is the primary focus of this webinar, there is not one unique answer. It depends very much on the residual, on the cost of fertilizer and the rate with which you apply the fertilizer. So if you apply higher rates, and back in the days when I used to do research with micronutrients, we were putting anywhere from 3 to 5 pounds of copper, and it was good. Our trials stopped at 6 years. And zinc, my apologies, both copper and zinc. Our trials stopped 6 years after the application, but I was in Australia where they had trials going 12 years, and there was still residual value from these 3 to 5 pounds. But if you're applying only 1 or 1.5, it may not be just as it may not have as much residual value. When it comes to nitrogen, now it depends. Again, we had work done about the fertilizer. It depends very much when you apply the fertilizer, whether you apply it in the fall, in the spring, and in the fall, it depends very much when in the fall. In our research, we found out when it was late October and even the beginning of November, really we couldn't distinguish any difference between different products. But liquid products, I would keep them until the following spring. So, from that perspective. So since liquids also for micronutrients are applied at lower rates, the residual value from that is not going to be will not last as long as it would be for dry products. Because I remember back in when I was doing research with micronutrients, the rate for zinc sulfate or copper sulfate was, like I said, 3 to 5 pounds. But for EDTA, it would be half a pound or 1. So don't expect to have this, residual effect. So I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. Thank you. Next question is geographically specific. This is also from Christy Dupuis at Lake Country Co-op. Which micros are actually worth implementing in Northeast Saskatchewan, and are foliars ever successful in that area?
Well, I was just really excited when I saw this question, because if you go back to 1981, when I started the research on micronutrients at the University of Saskatchewan, guess where we started from? Melfort and the Northeast Saskatchewan. And yes, there were some very severe, at that time, copper deficiencies, but eventually, especially when you grow pulse, what we found out, legumes, pulses, pardon me, we found that the zinc is becoming more and more of an issue. And yes, you have to, especially, as I mentioned, also from a soil texture point of view, as you move to the Northeast, you have a lot of sandy soils. Consequently, you have a lot of micronutrient deficiencies, especially copper and zinc are the major issues, to be careful of. Okay, and now, are foliar applications successful? Well, depends very much. One thing to remember, and I'm going to cover it again because one question was later on. You got to remember that 75% of the nutrients for our major crops like the cereals, wheat, barley and so forth, and canola to a certain extent are taken up by the plant in the first 25 to 30%, quarter to a third of their growth. Now, if you wait until you have enough ground cover in order to apply foliar, and that would be the first node visible for cereals or 6 to 8 leaf stages for canola, as an example, then you may have an issue because at that time you'll get a response, but you may not get the maximum yield. Yes, they are very successful, but you gotta weigh, what the circumstances are. Again, that's another question that came up later on. If it is dry in the spring and you're not applying much because it's dry, and then all of a sudden the sky opens, yeah, absolutely. The foliar applications will be successful. And we've had a lot of research in Western Canada that shows that foliar micronutrient applications are extremely effective.
Okay, thank you for that. And let's move on here. And I believe this is also from Christy. Christy's like me. She's very curious, I guess. And this one is, will there ever be a re-evaluation of safe levels of seed-placed fertilizer based on soil type and region? And I'm assuming this refers to a previous evaluation, and that data may be outdated. I'm thinking that's the question line here.
Well, I wish. If you may or may not be aware that back in 1999, I introduced a calculator that I developed for Western Canada for the safe rates of nitrogen fertilizer. And I have modified that since, and I'll be happy to share with you. But that's specific to nitrogen. Also, there is an excellent tool from South Dakota State University for phosphorus for different forms as far as safe levels of seed-placed fertilizer. But like I said, this goes back 15 years, 20, I haven't seen anything, since. Now, when it comes to micronutrients, yes, we did work at the University of Manitoba. It was part of a master's thesis where we looked at applying, but not from a safety point of view. We were looking for effectiveness point of view, because the half a pound and 1 pound of micronutrients they were applying were safe anyway, So also another thing that is what is happening quite a bit more recently is people are side banding instead of seed placing. And we found out also some of the research that if you place your fertilizer an inch to the side and an inch below, oh my goodness, you can put a lot of fertilizer down.
I'm just wondering here, on this conversation, because does seed size affect how much fertilizer can be placed with a seed, or is that irrelevant?
Oh, yeah, it will to a certain extent, yes. Because the effect, you see, the thing is, what if really affecting the damage or, would be on the the surface area that is exposed to the fertilizer. So the moral of the story is depends now, that based on the size of the seed, you may have a large area exposed, may have a small area exposed, Now, if you have a lot of small seeds put together, you have more area than you have if you have one big one, But there is an effect.
Is there a calculator or something that exists, Rigas, where those different seed sizes can be taken into account in some kind of a deterministic way?
No, I haven't seen anything like that. Sorry.
Okay, thank you. Let's move along here. And this is also from Christy, I believe. And The question is, are split applications of fertilizer based on growing conditions the way of the future to reduce lodging, maximize yields in varied conditions? So this is part of the greater
Yeah,
conversation of precision
right.
agriculture.
Yeah, we talked about, well, I mentioned a little bit that it depends very much on the crop and weather conditions, of course. When you have, a dry spring and you may wish to apply a small portion of the fertilizer at that time, so you don't waste your money because you never know what the weather is going to develop. And then all of a sudden, as I mentioned, the sky opens up. Absolutely top dress later on. Remember that, as I mentioned, that crops consume 75% of their nutrient requirements the first quarter to a third of its life. There is an exception, which is corn, that needs nutrients later on in their development as well, in the plant development. So delaying nutrient application past the first node being visible in cereals and 6 to 8 leaves in canola will still result in higher yields, but you're not going to get the maximum yield if the weather was normal, to put it in quotation marks. Okay, so keep that in mind. It's
Yeah. Yep. No, that makes a lot of sense, Rigas. And I just wanted to ask a question here. While we were just talking about how does that fit with in agriculture the 4 R's and the economics of growing?
well, that's a very good question because 4 R's, like it fits the right fertilizer, and which form you're going to pick up, the right time, the right place, and the right rate. So I mean, it fits perfectly, in terms of and already mentioned the right time for most crops is the first quarter of their since the first quarter of their life. So you seed say in mid May 1st. Well, by the end of May, beginning of June, that's where most of 75% of the uptake is going to have taken place. So it fits perfectly with the 4 R's. Yes.
I see. And time release fertilizers, and just in the context of with Soileos, because it releases based on biological demand, because there's a
Correct.
relationship
Yes.
between Soileos and the soil microbiome.
Right.
And on this discussion of the bulk of the nutrient uptake taking place over that first quarter of the growth, then I think we can assume that there's a synergistic response from the soil microbiome to
Right.
that because of the evolutionary history of the
Oh,
microbiome
yes,
and plants.
absolutely. Yeah, I mean, the thing is, just because 75% is released in the beginning, it doesn't mean that it's not. Well, let's, now you mentioned Soileos, because there is a little bit of difference between that and other products. Because remember, when you're looking at the nutrient use efficiency of some products, what is the nutrient use efficiency of some products? Say, for example, zinc sulfate or zinc oxide versus Soileos. The use efficiency is much lower, which means that, the release in that first 25, 30% of, quarter to a third of its life from Soileos is going to be greater than it would be from dry products. So you have to put that into account too, take it into consideration that maybe, it is the 1/3, a quarter to a third of since the plant was seeded, but what is the availability and the release of nutrients from its product? And that's what I think it makes a difference based on what I've seen from your trials.
Understood. Yeah, it's the greater discussion of bioavailability, which we could probably talk about for hours, but we don't have hours today just to talk about that one topic. I just like to just a note out to our participants. If you have any live questions for us, we're happy to take your live questions at this time. And if you want to propose a question, please either use the Q&A form, which on Zoom, there's a little circle on the control bar on the right side says more. And in that little circle that says more, there's a button for a Q&A window that'll come up. Or you can just enter it into the chat, whatever you want. So I'm going to go on with a couple of other questions here. And just moving along. My soil tests show low zinc, but have I applied zinc before? Why isn't it working? And I'm thinking this is going back to that conversation of bioavailability.
Well, when I looked at that, that was one of the questions that I mentioned to Jason on the phone before, and I said, I need more information.
Mm.
When we're talking my soil test so low zinc, so what is the soil test? And which lab did you get the soil test from? What crop are we talking about? What was the rate of application? Because if somebody, I mean, I know it just sounds goofy, but if somebody went and spread a pound of zinc, you have one granule here and one granule 12, 15 inches away. And if you sample in between, of course, zinc levels haven't changed, So I need more information in order to answer this question, The soil test, low zinc, if it is low, and you have applied zinc, the right amount, the right product, why should it not be working? It will be working unless it was a dry weather or some, extraordinary situation.
Yeah, and you might even need to do, several soil tests instead of just one. And we've also seen this, Rigas, like in our research laboratories, we've seen quite a bit of variation on the results depending on which lab is doing the test.
Oh, absolutely, yes.
Yeah. Let's move along here. Is it okay? This is an important one, and this is I know, Rigas, you're going to be dying to answer this one. Is it okay to lower the rate of just one fertilizer, or should I be reducing all fertilized rates in a balanced way? For example, maybe budget is a limitation 1 year. Can you just cut back one?
Okay. Let's go back to my webinar that I gave, my presentation. There seems to be a confusion between balanced nutrition and balanced fertilization. There are two different things. Let me repeat what I gave at that time. It was that the terms sometimes can be considered synonymous, but when balanced fertilization refers to fertilization programs that balance the total nutrition of the plant, supplemented with fertilizer, whatever the soil cannot supply. That is the major thing. You got to supplement whatever the soil cannot supply. But in some instances, it's taken to mean that fertilizers are applied in certain ratios, independent of what the soil test is. That's not right. Do your soil test. Some nutrients may be already, adequate. And when you want to maintain balance in nutrition, that doesn't mean that you're going to apply all the nutrients. You're going to apply the remaining of the nutrients. Like, for example, you have a micronutrient deficiency, right? We're talking about zinc. Well, maybe it's a soil that has high phosphorus, high potassium levels. You don't have to apply phosphorus and potassium. Apply the zinc and the nitrogen, if which we do most of the time. So the moral of the story, balanced fertility means that the nutrients that go into the plant has to be balanced. But that doesn't mean that you have to apply them also in certain ratios, okay? So I hope that clears up this question.
Yeah, and Rigas, you used the term, we've said the word soil test several times, and I think everyone is in agreement that soil testing is extremely important in today's agricultural demands.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah, so that's, I think, advice. If you don't soil test yet,
Yep.
we recommend that you do, because how do you know?
Absolutely.
How do you know what you need to add if you don't have data to back that up, right?
Oh, absolutely, yes.
So here's another one. Does soil pH mess with how my crops take up zinc and other micros?
Well, yeah, as a matter of fact, yes, it does. If you look, and I can give a whole presentation on it, but I will refrain from that. But if you look, actually, you will find out that as the soil pH increases, the availability of micronutrients decreases, with one exception, and that's molybdenum. All the rest of the micronutrients, when the pH goes above 7, 7.5, 8, you will see that the availability of the micronutrients drops. Now, this is based on soil chemical reactions. So, according to the relationship between the soil pH and the micronutrients, you would expect that, soils with, soils that are calcareous, that have, a lot of calcium carbonate, and the pH is very high, will be very deficient in micronutrients, or potentially deficient in micronutrients. Now, there are some soils on the prairies that have pH that is more than 7, and still they've been identified to be copper deficient, but that doesn't matter. A copper shortage should not be expected to occur in this slightly acidic soil. I mean, the soils are acidic, my apologies, But the moral of the story is you have acid soils, and in essence, you should have, except for molybdenum, available micronutrients. But as the pH climbs up and goes above 7, you may start seeing micronutrient deficiency. So yes, there is a relationship between pH and micronutrient availability.
Okay, thank you. And let me just move it along here to the next one, which is also the topic about microbial activity keeps coming up in this webinar. How do we prevent early season zinc deficiencies in cool prairie soils where microbial activity is low during planting?
Well, depends, early season deficiency. And that is probably referring to the Soileos product, right? Because we, the microbial activity is low, and maybe that refers to that, in which case you have to take into account that in that particular case, when we are talking about the Soileos product, from what I understand, the zinc is on the outer portion of the granule or the fertilizer, and consequently, it's more accessible by soil microbes and the rooting zone. But depends if you were to to have, for example, zinc oxide, well, you're in trouble, But I don't know if this question is particular to the Soileos or in general.
I think this is just in general.
Yeah. So, but the microbial activity, it's not the microbial activity that determines the solubility and availability of zinc. It's it's the solubility, not the microbial. The microbial, that's why I said maybe it's specific to Soileos, because the rest of the products are not, if there is enough water, it'll become soluble. Now, the cool weather will prevent the function of the rooting zone. That's maybe that this question refers to. In which case, yeah, you're going to have an issue, and there is nothing you can do about it. The cool weather is cool weather, but the thing is that if you notice, it's a good, we're talking about the soil test, but another good plan is to do a tissue test, and foliar application of micronutrients is extremely, extremely efficient. So if you are noticing in the plant that you have very low zinc levels, apply a foliar product to correct the deficiency.
And then, just another comment on the way we designed Soileos to work is that it releases nutrients in direct response to microbial activity. So when the soil is cool, the microbial activity is low, and the rate of release from Soileos is low, but correspondingly, later on in the plant life cycle, when the soils warm up, the microbial activity increases, and that's when the Soileos products will maximize their release rate. It's in direct synergistic response.
Right. Yeah, that's exactly, That's
David Borth just put one up on the chat, and I'll just read it. Is there any general difference between phosphorus availability between gray wooded soil, gray luvisols, and prairie brown, dark brown, and black soil types? So I'll just read that again, and then it's a two-part question. I'll just read that again. Is there any general difference between phosphorus availability between gray wooded soil, gray luvisols, and prairie brown, dark brown, and black soil types? And he mentions here in particular acidic gray luvisols.
Well, yeah, the availability, it does depend on the soil pH, and is there is, but it has to do with sometimes it's more of issue of pH and parent material from which the soils have been developed. And like I said, sometimes you look at the organic matter, like some of the phosphorus comes from the organic matter, some comes from, and as you move from brown, dark brown, black up to the luvisols, the parent material or the compounds that from which phosphorus has been, mineralized. I mean, not well. There is some mineralization, but it's also, released because phosphorus. The reactions are a little bit different. There are more chemical reactions. The binding of phosphorus, it's more. There is actually a PhD thesis at the University of Saskatchewan. They looked at at the biological effects, but that's the only thing. Most of the reactions with phosphorus are chemical reactions, and based on that, and based on the pHs and so forth, yes, you would expect to have, lower availability as you move up to. The gray wooded, and the acidic soils, because the chemical reactions will be, different. So yeah, you have to apply those nutrients, phosphorus, in order to eliminate that deficiency. Yes.
And the second part of David's question, which is very closely related and also on the topic of, again, availability, is there a general benefit from applied phosphorus and potassium on acidic gray luvisols, even when these nutrient levels are high?
Well, to be honest with you, I do not have a direct answer for that. Again, if the nutrient levels are high, I would, well, I would be very reluctant at adding more. But the moral of the story is that even when nutrients levels are high, that is based on what your soil test gives you, right?
Yeah.
However, when you grow a crop, I mean, it's inadvertently a must to put 10 to 15 pounds of phosphorus, even when the levels are high, because it doesn't matter whether it's Luvisol, it's a good idea to have 10 to 15 pounds of phosphorus with the seed so it can be directly available by the plant roots. Because, the levels can be high, but are they available? And it's not just the Luvisols, that can happen with any crop. I mean, any soil. But yes, you have to. I would recommend that you put some with the seed.
Yep. I think that's a good answer, and this brings us back to when we're talking about soil tests. Is a soil test does not tell you about the bioavailability
No.
of a nutrient in the soil. And as far as we've looked at this, our whole science team, trying to answer this question is: can you directly and accurately measure nutrient availability? And this is still experimental. Like no one's actually really figured that out yet.
No.
So I think you answered that question very well. But of course, there's always some unknown when we're talking about availability,
Correct.
especially in high pH.
Correct.
Let's go to the next one here. My fields have both sandy and heavy clay spots. How do I make sure nutrients are available everywhere?
Well, going back to the 4 hours. you gotta, obviously you will have to sample these areas separately and fertilize appropriately for each area, because you should be expecting differences. So there is huge difference between sandy and heavy clay spots. And I'm talking about all the nutrients, micronutrients, macronutrients. So the moral of the story is you have to make sure you sample them separately and address them accordingly. That's the moral of the story.
Okay, thank you. We just had a question come in from Jack Payne, and his question is: how much more efficient is phosphate fertilizer when it is seed placed alone and side banded with urea compared to phosphate, which is only seed placed?
Well, actually, you got to realize that it takes actually side banded. Sometimes can be side banded 1 inch to the side and 1 inch below. Is very effective, extremely effective. And sometimes it can be more effective than phosphorus, because you play the phosphorus with the seed, and then the seed, the roots grow and they have to find phosphorus. And if we know that phosphorus, there is some dissolving of the phosphorus in the soil, but there is much more, greater availability to side banding 1 inch to the side and 1 inch below. So it's going to work inadvertently all the time. So I don't think there is that huge, phosphate side banded with urea. It's great, I think, as far as the research that I have done. We found it to be extremely effective. 1 inch to the side and 1 inch below, all the time. And I had some trials, believe it or not, that I put nitrogen anywhere between 100 and 200 pounds of nitrogen per acre. and I added 27 pounds of phosphorus, 27 pounds of potassium, and 15 pounds of sulfur, all side banded, and we got amazing results. So, Jack, side banding is extremely effective all the time.
Got it. Thank you. Here's one. Again, it's the question of availability. How does Soileos compare to sulfate-based fertilizers or EDTA chelates in terms of plant availability?
Well, the thing is, if you look at the makeup of Soileos, from what I understand, and I have to be very honest with the group, I have not worked directly with the product, but I have gone and I've looked at all the research that has been done. And my conclusion, looking at the Soileos, compare, say, to, say, zinc sulfate. Well, the sulfate product, whether it's zinc, copper, whatever it is, it can become tied up in the soil. Whereas Soileos, because of the way it's being released in the soil, there is a continuous, if you want to put it that, and we mentioned that already, there is a continuous release that gives plant available micronutrients. So that allows for efficient uptake during the growing season. So I think that Soileos, based on what I've seen from the results, is performing just as well, and in some instances, in some of the data, better than the EDTA products. So I think that it's because it is I don't know, it's a biodegradable and product, and therefore it takes, its availability is for a longer period of time, and it doesn't, like oxides don't resolve sometimes, depending on the soil pH, and so forth.
Thank you. Yeah, no, that makes complete sense. I'm just going to encourage our participants to ask any live questions they like. You can either enter them into the webinar chat or the Q&A. And because we're going to be wrapping up our webinar here in a short period of time. So get those live questions in. Now's your chance, people. Let's go to another question here, which is this one. What are the factors that can cause a micronutrient deficiency? And Rigas, I'm assuming that the answer to this question would probably vary wildly depending on what soil type you're in. Well,
if you go back to the presentation and I gave, the responses to micronutrients can be obtained either through soil deficiencies or plant physiological effects. Now, the soil deficiencies, as I mentioned already, not just for micronutrients, but it depends very much on the parent materials from which the soil has been developed. And you have parent materials like go, for example, in Outlook, south of Saskatoon, and you're going to find a lot of zinc deficiencies. Why? Because the parent materials there don't have zinc to provide to the plants, And I did some research there, Back in the day, I had a graduate student. We did 53 trials with zinc, and Outlook was one where we were finding responses with zinc, as an example. Okay, so that is, you can have soil deficiencies, and then of course, the other thing is, as I mentioned already, you have the interaction between, well, it's not an interaction. Well, you can call it interaction between zinc and phosphorus. So you have that, and we I had a grad student look at the zinc phosphorus interaction on wheat, but also he looked at the zinc phosphorus interaction on beans, and it was exactly the same problem. So keep that, so there are two factors. One will be the parent material from which the soil has been developed, and the other will be plant physiological effects. The interaction, the mycorrhiza is a great example.
Mm. Okay, and we're going to switch gears a little bit to a different question. What is the carbon footprint of soils compared to synthetic fertilizers? Perhaps I can address that one because I was involved in some of the research. So Rika said you weren't in our labs when we did this. So we've been very interested in this. We get asked this a lot because Soileos is made. When you hold it in your hand, most of what's in your hand is cellulose. It's made out of a cellulose-based material, which of course will biodegrade. So in our study, we actually had this funded by Shell. It was about a $750,000 project where we looked at the carbon drawdown of actual crops with Soileos, and also in comparing that to the same crops with status quo fertilizers. And we looked at soil organic carbon buildup in the soil, but we also looked at the off-gassing of greenhouse gas emissions. And the answer is it's about 10 to 1. So for every unit of Soileos that is applied, approximately 10x of that, 10 times that amount, is sequestered carbon in the soils. And I think there's probably going to be a question shortly about, in the carbon markets, and is there a way for growers to monetize that? There isn't yet. We've been looking at this very closely. We would love to see a carbon market develop so growers can take advantage of the CO2 they draw down, which of course they are. We all know that. But that is still under development. The carbon market is a very complicated Byzantine mechanism, and there is not yet a simple, easy way for growers to access the carbon drawdown. So I think, Nicole, you just put out while I was talking about this in the webinar chat, if you're interested in the carbon footprint and the environmental footprint of Soileos, we did an extensive study, and that PDF is available right there. So I think we've got time for one more, and then we're going to start wrapping this up. And let's look at this one. How will future fertilizer regulations impact zinc availability, and is Soileos a sustainable alternative? Yeah, so on that, there are a lot of regulations. You're probably aware of this, Rigas, is that we're seeing microplastic coated NPKs. There are regulations coming up, especially from Europe, where they want to prevent microplastic pollution in soils. And that is definitely, so there are environmental regulations coming down. I'm not aware of regulations coming up that are going to impact, for example, application of like a zinc sulfate, or no. Rigas, what's your thought on that?
Well, my thought is, if you look right now, the current, regulations are based on heavy metals. That's the only thing that is, and I've told people back in the day when I used to work for Viterra, we got a letter from the government, the federal government, say you can no longer sell nitrogen fertilizer. But what they did at that time is they assumed that all the nitrogen fertilizer that was used in Western Canada was ammonium sulfate. And ammonium sulfate at that time had 1%, of zinc. So they calculated this, well, you have exceeded the maximum level of zinc that you can apply to the soils. So I had to write a report and send it to the government, explaining to them that zinc is part of ammonium sulfate. It's not overall. So other than that, again, we're not adding zinc at the levels that are, that would meet or exceed what are the criteria for heavy metals at this point. So I'm not aware of anything else, that might affect, unless I don't know if there is anything with bioavailability, because there is some, movement towards biological products. But again, I haven't seen any regulations to that effect. So I don't think there is anything at the moment that we should be, concerned about.
Yeah, I haven't seen anything coming through the pipeline at this point. But previously, as we discussed, the microplastic coating that there's a lot of companies, and we're working on a solution to that also. It's not on the market yet, but we want to make sure our growing is profitable and sustainable at the same time. And on that note, are there any other last minute questions? And if not, I think we're going to wrap this up and close. Anybody have anything? No, I don't see anything there. So, Rigas, thank you very much. This has been there's been a lot of good back and forth here. It's been really exciting. And on that note, I'm going to hand it back to Leo.
Yes, thank you, Peter. Thank you, Rigas, and
Pleasure.
our team, and to our participants. So thank you so much for all your active participation in this session. If I had to summary to bring a summary to this conversation, I would say solid fertilizer residue lasts longer, and bring this to Soileos. That's interesting. We have been getting so many positive feedbacks from farmers saying that their especially zinc levels increased to 1 year from 1 year to another after applying Soileos. Nutrients that go to the plant need to be balanced. So that is interesting because of our product is bioavailable. So the plant will uptake the nutrient as the plant needs. This means balanced nutrition. And also sulfates and EDTA based fertilizer are not as quick as available as Soileos can be to the plant. So thank you, Rigas, for sharing all these valuable insights into fertility planning and the importance of a balanced nutrition approach to everyone. We encourage you to reach out to our team or your local agri-retailer. You will see my picture there a lot. I'm very open to talk to you. It will be my pleasure connecting with you after this session and discuss how Soileos can be integrated to better balanced nutrition in your crop for the 2025 season. So don't forget to follow us on our social media channels at Soileos for more agronomic content and updates. Thank you all for joining us today once again. So, and we wish you a successful growing season. One last mention about this webinar. The recording, we have a recording of this webinar, but we also have additional resource, that will be sent via email to you in the coming days. So you can check our blog. You can check once again our social media platform. We have our website, soileos.com, and we also have a nice podcast, the Back 40 broadcast. So you're welcome to go there, check, give us your feedback. We appreciate that, and we know this can be a very good resource as well. So thank you, everyone. You have a great day, and talk to you another time.
Thank you for the invite. Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody.